All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first ever online tea and tweets. And hopefully, we are reaching a brand new audience with this. I know a lot of you can't come out Tuesday mornings or Saturday mornings. So, welcome. And please feel free if you have any questions to post your questions or comments in the area below here on YouTube. You can also post your questions on Facebook or shoot us an email at info@thebirdhouseny.com. Because this is our first online class, I'm expecting there to possibly be some bumps in the road, so please bear with me. And after the fact, I do have a little survey. If you wouldn't mind filling out the survey, clicking on the link and letting us know how we can do better and possibly what classes you would like for us to have in the future. So today we are talking about sparrows, grackles, and starlings, what some people call the bully birds, and they can be the bane of some people's existence. But there are things you can do to help keep your yard free of these birds. Quite honestly, there's not much you can do to keep them 100% out of your yard, but there are some tips and tricks you can do to help keep them at bay. And so we will get started. First, I'd like to talk about house sparrows, and I think everybody does know house sparrows. They're going to be one of our most common songbirds that you'll find here in the area. They are an introduced species, so they were imported to North America in the 1850s. There were a lot of Europeans coming over to America at that time, and house sparrows were imported as well for nostalgic reasons, and they thought they'd be a good way to control insect populations. The issue with that is that house sparrows don't eat a lot of insects besides the nesting season, so they really didn't do all that great of a job at controlling those insect populations, unfortunately. And since their introduction, as you probably know, their range has spread tremendously. You can find them all over the United States. And on the left-hand side there is the female. So she's a little bit more drab than the male. And the male is there on the right. He's got a black mask, he's got a big black beak, and he's got that chestnut patch on his head. So the male and female do look different, and that's called being sexually dimorphic. And right now, because we are starting to get into breeding season, you might see males perched somewhere with their feathers all fluffed up, shaking their wings, shaking their tails, and that is their way to attract a mate. So don't be surprised if you see that behavior right now in your yard. So these are house sparrows, but don't be confused with other sparrows. There are a lot of other sparrow species you might see in your yard. House sparrows are probably going to be the most common, but you might see these as well as others. This is just 3 here that are pretty common. On the left, we have the American tree sparrow, and they have the chestnut patch on the top of their head. They don't have any streaking on their breast, but they have that polka dot. And they are common here in the wintertime. So once we hit breeding season, you're probably not going to see these in your yard, but you might see them right around now. So keep an eye out for those. They will come to their feeders. And one way you can identify them is because they have 2 different colors on their beak. It's a bicolored beak. So the top piece of their beak is black and the bottom piece is yellow. So that's one way you can identify the American tree sparrow, which is the sparrow on the left-hand side there. And then in the middle, we have the white-throated sparrow. And white-throated sparrows are around here in the wintertime. They tend to form flocks. If you're out hiking and you hear a lot of birds in the brush kind of on the ground, but you can't see them very well, it could be a group of white-throated sparrows. They tend to group up this time of the year. And they get their name because they have that bright white patch under their chin. And they also have white streaking on their head with some yellow above their eye. And we have another species of sparrow called the white-crowned sparrow that looks similar to the white-throated sparrow, but they're larger and they don't have the yellow by their eye, and they're missing that white throat patch. So white-crowned sparrows you might also see in your yard, especially during migration season as they go up a little bit further north to breed. But right now, be on the lookout for that sparrow in the middle called the white-throated sparrow. And then finally, on the right, we've got the song sparrow. And song sparrows get their name because they love to sing. So don't be surprised, especially in a couple weeks, if you see them perched high up on a tree or on a shrub. If there's a little sparrow just singing its heart out, that is a song sparrow. And the song sparrows do have a lot of streaking on their breast, as well as the polka dot like the American tree sparrow has. So these are just some other sparrows you might see in your yard. So not all sparrows are created equal. There are a lot of different species, and we will have classes about sparrows and just sparrows coming up soon in the future. So now let's talk about the European starling. So starlings were also introduced species, and they were introduced into the US around 1890. And they were introduced in Central Park, and there weren't many of them that were part of this introduction, but it was a group of people who were big fans of Shakespeare, and they wanted to introduce all birds that were part of Shakespeare's work into the New World, and so they did. They took these birds and released them into Central Park, and that's where all of the starlings that you can find here in the United States today have come from. And then there's the common grackle. And grackles and starlings, sometimes people get confused about and mixed up with. If we go back to the starling, take a look. The bird on the bottom there, that is an adult. And the adult male and female do look the same. They usually have iridescent feathers, bright yellow beak, and sometimes they have some speckling on them too. The speckling sometimes isn't as pronounced. And then up above, that's a juvenile. So the juvenile is a very drab brown, but one way you can identify them is they do have a very sharp, pointy beak. So, cowbirds will have more of a stunted beak. And to tell them apart from a grackle, take a look at their beak and also their eye. They have a very dark eye, whereas we look at the grackle and they have a light-colored eye. So that's one way you can tell the difference. Plus, grackles are, they're going to be larger, and both the grackles and the starlings, they do form large flocks. But the grackles, when they're in flight, they have more of a triangular tail. They're more elongated, so you can tell them apart with some slight differences. But the grackle, when you see it up close, they're a fairly large bird, mostly black with an iridescent blue head. Sometimes the iridescent blue, you can't see it depending on how the sun is shining on the bird. But most of the time you can see that blue head, except if they're a juvenile, like on the left there is a juvenile bird. And the blue isn't pronounced yet, but any birds that we have coming back into the area right now, they're going to be in their adult plumage, so they will have that shiny blue head. And the grackles have made their way back to the area. So far, they're kind of trickling in, but people are seeing them at their feeders, and they don't like to see them at their feeders, but it is a sign of spring. So keep that in mind. Now, both the European starling and the house sparrow are cavity nesters. So that means they will nest in houses. The grackles don't. Grackles will build nests in trees. They'll weave together grasses. So grackles nesting in places where you don't want them usually isn't an issue. It's more of a starling, and especially house sparrows, going into a birdhouse where you don't exactly want them to be. Especially if you're trying to get some of these species, like on the left, the eastern bluebird, and we've got the screech owl there on the right. The house sparrow can easily fit into a bluebird house. So bluebirds are a fairly large bird. They need an opening of 1.5 inches in diameter to fit inside of the house. And house sparrows can easily fit into a house that big. And now starlings, because they are a larger bird, they wouldn't be able to fit into a bluebird house, but they can fit into something like a screech owl house or a kestrel house, which has the same specs basically as a screech owl house, or even woodpecker houses. If you have a woodpecker house, be on the lookout and make sure you don't have a starling nesting in there. If you do have house sparrows or starlings nesting in a place you don't want them, because they're not a protected species, because they're introduced and non-native, that you can actually remove the nest You could remove the eggs. You could remove the birds even if you wanted to. And that rule also applies to pigeons. Pigeons are another bird that are not protected, but all the other birds are protected by the Migratory Bird Species Act, including the grackles. So this is something you might see in your birdhouses if you have a birdhouse with a smaller hole. Usually woodpeckers are notorious for doing this, or squirrels, but sometimes sparrows will peck away at the entrance hole to make it larger. And if they do, you can get these these little metal doors that you put on the outside of your birdhouse, and that will minimize the hole size. So you can make it small enough for a bluebird, so the starlings can't get inside the house, or you can make them small enough that only wrens or chickadees or nuthatches can fit in. And depending on the species of bird, the entrance hole to the house has to be a certain size. So basically, the larger the hole is, the more species it opens up to be able, the house opens up for birds to nest in. If you have a very small hole that's only about 1 1/8 inches in diameter, you can only get about a couple species. The wrens, the house wren, Carolina wren, chickadees, they'll be able to squeeze in there. And then as you slowly progress and get a larger hole size on your birdhouse, it opens it up for more species to be able to fit inside. So keep that in mind. How do you tell what's nesting in the house? If you don't see the bird coming and going, sometimes you can tell what kind of bird you have by what their nests look like. And on the left is the house sparrow nest, and they're not pretty. They will use just about anything to build their nest. They use a lot of grass, they use feathers, they use trash. You might find plastic in there, anything. They are not, they're not very clean. Tends to be kind of dusty if you open up the nest box. And they'll also build nests on top of other nests, which it looks like they did here. It looks like there was a sparrow nest and then another sparrow built on top of it. So they will keep building nests on top of each other. So that's a house sparrow nest. And then a starling nest is a little bit more neat. Starlings, because they can only fit into larger nest boxes, you wouldn't find this in a small bluebird house, but you could find it in the woodpecker box or screech owl box. They use a lot of long grasses, and they weave them together, and they have a very, very neat type of nest. But both of these nests can be pretty large and pretty tall. So don't be surprised if you open up a nest box and you see a really tall nest from one of these birds. Now, one thing you can do is there is such a thing as a sparrow-resistant house, and this is a sparrow-resistant bluebird house. And what makes this tend to be sparrow-resistant is, first of all, the opening. Sparrows prefer a circular entrance hole, but they don't care for a rectangular entrance like this house has. And bluebirds aren't as picky, so this bluebird here wouldn't mind a rectangular entrance for this house. Another thing that makes it sparrow resistant is sparrows prefer a deep nesting cavity. And it's kind of hard to tell from this picture, but this house has a very shallow nesting cavity. And inside there's a block of wood that actually makes the nesting cavity even more shallow. So sparrows prefer a deep nesting cavity, and bluebirds don't mind something that's shallow. So having this shallow nesting cavity will encourage bluebirds and discourage sparrows. And again, it's not 100%, but it does help keep them out because it just doesn't have the specs that they prefer in a house. Now, if you have a birdhouse out and you've got bluebirds coming, one thing you can do is put out a Sparrow Spooker. And what that is, it's a bunch of shiny streamers. We sell something called scare tape here at the birdhouse, and it's just shiny metallic mylar tape. And you can attach that to the house, and it tends to scare away birds. You don't want to attach it to the house until the bluebirds have established a nest, though. Once the bird has laid an egg into the house, they won't abandon the nest. So if you've got bluebirds coming and going, check inside the house, and if there is at least an egg laid, you can put up a sparrow spooker, and that will help keeping sparrows from taking over the nest. They're not the most beautiful things. Here are some more examples, but they do work. Birds in general don't like this shiny, reflective surface. So this is the same kind of tape you can use on your house if you have woodpeckers that are pecking the side of your house, if you have birds nesting where you don't want them. It's the same kind of tape. It's called scare tape. And this is one way to keep sparrows out of houses. Another thing you can do, we talked about having different hole sizes. This is a wren house, so these houses have really small openings. They've got an opening of about an inch and an eighth in diameter, and that's too small for sparrows. So you can attract wrens and chickadees with smaller size houses and discourage the sparrows. And then there's the feeders. Trying to keep these birds out of your feeders can be difficult. This is probably a familiar scene to most people. And the first thing I want to mention is the seed does matter. So the type of bird seed that you're feeding the birds makes a difference. If your bird seed looks like this, you want to make sure to change that immediately. Birds in general don't like the little yellow seeds that you'll find in a lot of seed blends. Sometimes they'll eat them, but a lot of times they'll throw it on the ground. So depending what kind of seeds are in the blends, if there's a lot of cracked corn, if there's a lot of millet, they'll ultimately eat that, but they prefer the sunflower seeds. So they're going to throw a lot of that yellow corn and things on the ground and go for the sunflower seed. And the more seed you have on the ground, the more susceptible you are to having a huge flock of blackbirds come and feed from that corn and the millet, because they will ultimately eat it. Now, one thing you can do is use safflower seed. And safflower seed looks like black oil sunflower, but it's white. It's about the same size. But the blackbirds don't like it. So grackles don't eat it. Starlings don't eat it. And sparrows will, but it's really not their favorite. So that's one great way to discourage them. And safflower seed is also fabulous because squirrels tend not to like it either. So you can offer safflower seed in a tube feeder. Like on the right here, we've got the tube feeder, and there's rose-breasted grosbeaks eating the safflower seed. They love it. It's also a favorite of the cardinal, and cardinals and grosbeaks are actually in the same family, and they both love the safflower seed. And also house finches love it too. So you can offer it loose in a tube feeder, or on the left here, this is what's called a seed log. It's all compressed together, and the birds will perch right on the log itself or on the perch of the feeder and just peck away at the little seeds. And the seed logs tend to not go as fast as the loose seed in a feeder. So if you put out a safflower seed log, you always have something out there for the cardinals. And the sparrows, they will eat it, but it's really not their favorite. They tend to go to other seeds. So that's one thing I would highly, highly recommend you try. And please let us know how it works for you. And then here's an indigo bunting eating the safflower seed, which we'll have them soon as they come in for the spring. Another thing you can do is put up fishing line on your feeder. Fishing line tends to scare the sparrows away. So there's different ways you can do it, but ultimately you want to take fishing line. You can put weights on it if you want. Again, fishing line with fishing weights, and tie it to your feeders or attach it around the feeders in some way. And you'll find that when sparrows try to go in and fly into the feeder, they will get scared and spooked, and they will fly out and fly away elsewhere. Again, it's not 100%, but a lot of people have had really, really good success with this. Another thing you can do to keep out some of the bigger pesty birds, especially the grackles and especially the starlings, is get a cage feeder. And these feeders have a cage around them, so it allows for little birds to go inside while the big birds get stuck outside. They can't fit inside. The positive things about this are you don't have to worry about grackles and starlings raiding your feeders. The downside is birds like cardinals and blue jays can't fit inside. So these are great feeders for smaller birds. Like on the left here, we've got a whole bunch of goldfinches inside. And then on the right, there's a downy woodpecker and a chickadee feeding from the Suet feeder with the cage. So they're great for smaller birds, but not so great for the larger birds. And then another thing you can do is get a feeder with small perches. Feeders with small perches that don't have trays will also attract the small birds, but it's difficult for the larger birds like grackles to land on them. And then here's a feeder we carry called the Sky Cafe. And normally it looks like this on the left, but you can get what's called a dove guard to put on it. And the picture on the right has the dove guard on it. It's just these plastic coated little spikes. And what they do is they kind of divvy up the feeder. So it's a bunch of small little perching stations. And cardinals can still land on there, but it's made to keep pigeons away. And what I've found is that it also helps keep grackles away. It's not 100%. Sometimes the grackles can still squeeze in there, but grackles are notorious for perching on a feeder and then just spilling seeds everywhere with their beaks, and it makes it so they can't do that. So that's another thing to help keep the grackles out if you're still feeding a mixed seed. And then there's Nyjer Feeders, and in general, grackles and starlings, they really don't like Nyjer. I've never had an issue with them going on my Nyjer feeders. The seed is very, very small, so they really, it's not worth the effort for them to try to get to the feeder. So Nyjer is a great seed to feed. If you have a Nyjer feeder out and you haven't had many birds on it recently, make sure the feeder is clean, because it can get moldy. If there's any moisture that gets into it, they can get moldy pretty easily. And also make sure that the seed is fresh, because Nyjer can go bad after 2 or 3 months. And we get this question all the time: why are there no finches at my feeder? Finches are kind of finicky. They tend to flock around without much rhyme or reason, so they can be very unpredictable. But they're also pretty picky. So if the feeder's dirty or if the seed is old, they will not come to it. And we do have finches here all year round. We've got the goldfinches here in the picture. Just this time of the year, they are more drab in color, so they're not that bright gold. They're just about to turn, but they're still not that bright gold that we're used to seeing in the spring and summertime. So a Nyjer feeder is a great way to encourage some birds, but keep the starlings and grackles out. And then if you have sparrows that are raiding your Nyjer feeder, try an upside down Nyjer feeder. And upside down Nyjer feeders are fun because the perches are above the feeding ports. So in the pictures here, you can see the goldfinches are actually turned upside down to feed, and finches can do this, chickadees can do this, but the sparrows can't. They have a hard time clinging like that upside down and feeding. So this is one way you can encourage your finches, but keep the sparrows away as well. And then there's upside down suet feeders. Starlings and grackles can make really quick work of a suet cake. And this is the same idea like the upside down Nyjer feeder. The suet is underneath the feeder, and woodpeckers are very versatile. They can cling to almost any kind of surface. So they can easily feed from this upside down suet feeder. We've got a nuthatch here on the left-hand side and then a flicker on the right, and they are feeding from the upside down suet feeder. So they can cling to it like this, but the starlings and the grackles can't. So that's another thing to do. The best thing if you get an upside down suet feeder is put it where you have a suet feeder already established, because it's not super visible that there's food in there. It can take the birds a little bit of time to realize that there is food in there. So it can take a little bit of time for it to become established, but they do work. So to sum it up, there are a lot of different things you can do to try to discourage these birds, and some of them are pretty species specific, so it depends on which bird you're trying to discourage, if it's the sparrows or the starlings or the grackles. But there are some tips that can get you started right away that should make a big difference. The first is start with some safflower seed. Try safflower. Don't mix it with anything, because if you mix your safflower seed in with another seed blend, the grackles and the starlings, they'll just throw the safflower on the ground and go for the seed that they want. So just have straight safflower in the feeders. We have a lot of customers that switch from a seed blend to safflower in the spring and summer once the grackles come in, because it can be kind of pushy. So try safflower seed and see if that makes a difference. That can be a very, very simple way to solve your issues. And then add fishing line. Really simple, just drape some fishing line around your feeders. If you have a shepherd's hook, or if you have your feeders hanging from a tree, just hang the line from the outermost branches so it's kind of draped around the feeder. And then go upside down. Get a feeder that requires the birds to feed upside down, and that can make a big difference as well. And then consider the types of birdhouses you have in your yard. If you've got a lot of sparrows and you're trying to discourage them, make sure you don't have any places that they can nest, because they can have many broods a year. They're already starting to mate. They're looking for nesting sites now. So discouraging their nesting habits, that can make a huge difference as well. So that's everything we have for you today. I thank you guys for sticking with it and watching the whole video. Normally the video, or when we have presentations in the store, because we have customer participation and whatnot, they tend to go a little bit longer. So hopefully soon we'll be having classes back at the store, and please feel free to stop in, and we've got a whole schedule of events for the year. But until then, we will have some more videos online here for you. And if you have any comments or questions, please let us know in the comments below. And thank you again for watching.